The first thing I understood was the pain in my wrists. The second thing I understood was that I was wearing a wedding dress soaked in blood at the cuffs, and that the blood was mine. I lay very still on a stone floor that was much too cold for a room this beautiful, staring up at a ceiling painted with constellations I didn't recognize, and I tried to remember how I had gotten here. There had been headlights, there had been rain on a windshield, and the particular screech of tires that no amount of forgetting ever quite erases. And then there had been nothing, a long gray nothing, and now there was this, white silk, torn at the hem, and shards of glass scattered across the floor, like something had tried very hard to break its way out of this room, and failed. I sat up, my head spun, my wrists ached where the skin had split, and when I looked down at them, I saw thin cuts, already scabbing, the kind you get from forcing your hands through a broken window. Someone had tried to escape. Recently, violently. I was fairly sure that someone had been me, in whatever body I currently occupied, though the reflection in the tall, gilded mirror across the room belonged to a stranger. Pale gold hair instead of my own dark brown. A face too fine-boned to be mine, too finished, like a portrait rather than a person. I pressed my fingers to my cheek and watched the stranger in the mirror do the same, and something in my chest went cold and small and very, very afraid. Before I could get further than it, "This is impossible." The doors at the far end of the room opened, and 4 armored guards strode in like they expected to find a corpse, and were mildly disappointed not to. "Lady Eveline," the lead guard said, dropping into a stiff bow that didn't reach his eyes. "You're needed. The Duchess has asked that you be presentable within the hour." Eveline. The name hit me like a physical blow, because I knew it. I knew it the way you know a song you haven't heard in years, the instant the first 3 notes play. Eveline Marrow, disposable bride of Duchess Seraphine Veyre, the Black Duchess of the North, greatest and most feared military commander in the Kingdom of Aster. I had read this. Months ago, late at night, the kind of trashy fantasy novel you devour in a weekend because the villainess was more interesting than the actual heroine. I had rooted for the real couple in that book, a plucky royal scholar and a soldier with a heart of gold, and I had barely registered Eveline Marrow at all, because Eveline Marrow was set dressing. A political bride handed to a monster to keep the peace. She spied for the crown out of fear. She died before the book's midpoint, off-page, in a single paragraph that existed mostly to raise the stakes for people who actually mattered. I was going to die in under 4 months. I remembered that much with sick, specific clarity, because I remembered thinking, even as I read it, that's an awfully cold way to kill someone off. The guards were still watching me. I made myself stand, because standing seemed safer than sitting on the floor in a blood-stained gown, having an existential crisis in front of armed men. "I need a moment," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt, low and cultured in a way that wasn't quite mine. Eveline's voice, apparently, came with the body. "The Duchess does not wait," the guard said. But before he could say anything else, the doors opened again, and every one of them straightened so fast I heard armor clink. She was taller than I expected. That was my first thought, absurdly. Not she's beautiful. Though she was, in the way a drawn blade is beautiful, all clean lines and controlled danger. Black hair pulled back severely from a face that looked carved rather than born. Eyes so dark they read as black in the low light, fixed on me with an intensity that made the guards seem like furniture by comparison. I had expected fury. The novel had painted her as indifferent to her disposable bride at best, actively venomous at worst. Instead, Seraphine Veyre stopped 3 steps into the room and stopped breathing. I watched her do it. Watched the color drain out of a face that didn't have much color to spare in the first place. Watched her hand come up as though to steady herself against nothing. Watched every carefully constructed inch of the most feared woman in the North come apart in the space of a single second. "Leora," she whispered. I had never heard the name before in my life, and yet something in my chest, not my memory, not my mind, something lower and older than either, twisted at the sound of it like it recognized its own name being called from very far away. "Out!" Seraphine said. Not to me, and the guards fled so fast the door nearly caught one of their heels. Then she crossed the room in 3 strides and took my face in both hands, and her hands were shaking, and up close I could see that her eyes were wet, actually wet, and she was searching my face with the kind of desperation I associated with people identifying bodies. "You're real," she said, so quietly it barely qualified as speech. "You're—" She stopped. I watched the exact moment she understood I didn't know her. My face, Eveline's face, must have given nothing back. No recognition, no warmth, nothing but confusion and fear, and I watched that understanding land in her like a second death. Her hands fell away from my face like they'd been burned. "Forgive me," she said, and her voice had gone flat and cold. Every trace of the woman who'd whispered a stranger's name a moment ago folded away somewhere I couldn't reach. That was inappropriate. "You are Lady Eveline Marrow, my wife, as of this morning." "Who's Leora?" I asked, because apparently self-preservation was going to take a back seat to curiosity for the rest of my life. Something moved behind her eyes, brief and violent as lightning. "No one," she said. "A ghost. It won't happen again." She turned to leave. At the door she paused, and without looking back she said, "No one will touch you tonight, or any night, without your consent. I've had a second room prepared. Rest, Lady Marrow." And then, so quiet I almost missed it. "You're safe here." It sounded less like a promise and more like a plea. The door shut. I stood alone in a room full of broken glass and somebody else's blood, and I thought, I am going to die in 4 months, married to a woman who just looked at me like I'd risen from the grave, and I don't even know why. Before we return to the story, a quick note for my lovely viewers. While this YouTube series keeps things safe, my Patreon is where the real fun happens. That's where you'll find completely uncensored GL stories, much hotter exclusive videos, and bolder adventures that are just too spicy for YouTube. If you want the full, no-limits experience, and to support more of this kind of storytelling, the Patreon link is in the description below. I spent that first night in the second room, which turned out to be a modest chamber down the hall, with a fireplace already lit and a plate of food already waiting, untouched, as though someone had ordered it and then forgotten to eat it. I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, turning the pieces over in my head, cataloging everything I remembered about the novel, which, I was quickly discovering, was less than I wanted it to be. I remembered broad strokes. I remembered a masquerade where something terrible happened. I remembered that Eveline Marrow spied for the crown and died for it, blamed on the Duchess's cruelty. I remembered that the real heroine, a scholar named Wren, eventually helped bring the Black Duchess down as one of the final antagonists. I did not remember anyone named Leora, not a single mention, which meant either the book had left something out, or I was no longer entirely inside the book at all. By morning I had a strategy, or at least the outline of one. Don't spy, don't trust my new father-in-law's letters, avoid the masquerade if humanly possible, and above all, do not let Seraphine Veyre decide I was expendable. It was not a sophisticated plan. I was not a sophisticated woman. In my old life, the life with headlights and rain, the life I was increasingly sure I wasn't returning to, I had been a junior archival conservator, the kind of person who spent her days easing 400-year-old glue off brittle paper with a scalpel and a magnifying lamp. I noticed things. That was my only skill. I noticed water stains and foxing, and the particular grain of a forged signature. I was not going to survive this world through swordplay or magic. If I survived it at all, it would be because I paid closer attention than everyone expected me to. Over the following days, I began paying attention to Veyre Castle itself, and Veyre Castle began, in its own guarded way, paying attention back. The housekeeper, a stern woman with iron-gray hair named Mathilde, brought my meals herself, instead of sending a servant, which I initially took for suspicion, until I noticed she always brought a little more than I'd eat, the way you feed a stray animal you don't want to admit you're feeding. Lady Cassia Wren, the Duchess's cousin, appeared on my third day with the particular brightness of someone conducting an interrogation disguised as a social call, asked me 17 questions about my childhood that I answered as vaguely as I could, and left looking unsatisfied and faintly worried. "And Seraphine?" Seraphine was everywhere and nowhere. I would turn a corner and find her already watching me from across a courtyard, and by the time I registered her, she'd already be walking away. A blue shawl appeared in my wardrobe with no explanation. When I mentioned, offhand, to a maid that I preferred green, the shawl vanished by evening, and a green one took its place. And I later learned, because servants gossip regardless of which century you're in, that the Duchess herself had gone to the seamstress at midnight to have it made. She said you always preferred blue, the maid told me, folding linens, not looking at me. She looked very upset when I told her that wasn't so. I filed that away with the rest of the impossible things. The impossible things multiplied. She caught a teacup I hadn't yet knocked over, her hand simply appearing under it a half-second before my elbow did. She left honey beside my tea without being asked, and I liked honey in my tea, though I couldn't remember ever telling anyone that. During the first real storm of the season, thunder cracking over the castle like the sky itself was under siege, I woke from a nightmare I couldn't recall with tears already on my face, and my throat raw from a scream I didn't remember making, and Seraphine was there before I'd even sat all the way up, kneeling by my bed with an expression that had nothing careful left in it at all. I clung to her. I want to be honest about that, because it matters later. For one unguarded moment, I clung to a woman I'd known for 11 days, like she was the only solid thing in a world made of smoke, and she held me like she'd been waiting years for the chance. Leora, she breathed into my hair, and I felt her whole body go still with the word, like she'd said something she couldn't take back. I pulled away so fast I nearly fell out of the bed. Don't, I said. Don't call me that. You don't even know me. Her face did something complicated and painful. No, she agreed quietly. I don't. I'm sorry. She stood, put the careful mask back on like armor, and left before I could say anything else. And I lay awake the rest of the night, hating how much I'd wanted her to stay. A political banquet arrived before any of that, barely 10 days into the marriage, and it was my first real introduction to the court that feared my wife. I wore a gown the color of deep pine, chosen deliberately over the pale blues and golds the other noble women favored, and I spent the evening being studied like an exhibit by people who clearly expected me to either cower or connive, and seemed faintly disappointed when I did neither. Seraphine stood at my side through most of it, one hand resting at the small of my back, with a possessiveness that had less to do with ownership than with making absolutely certain everyone in the room understood I was not a target they could approach unguarded. They're wondering why you don't seem afraid of me, she murmured at one point, close to my ear, as a cluster of minor lords retreated from our vicinity with poorly disguised haste. Should I be? No, she said, simply, and something in the certainty of it settled a nervousness in my chest I hadn't fully acknowledged until it was gone. A young viscountess cornered me near the refreshment table later that night, all bright smiles and sharper questions, clearly fishing for some scandal she could carry back to her circle. I answered her with the same careful vagueness I'd used on Cassia weeks earlier, and I watched her leave unsatisfied, and I understood, with a small thrill of accomplishment, that I was actually getting better at this, at being Lady Marrow, Duchess Veyre's wife, a woman with secrets worth protecting, rather than a frightened girl waiting to be discovered. Seraphine found me an hour later, retrieved 2 glasses of wine neither of us particularly wanted, and steered me out onto a side balcony away from the noise. You did well tonight, she said. I lied to 17 people about my childhood. You survived a room full of people who would happily see either of us destroyed, she corrected. That's a different skill than lying. I'd call it the same skill I use in every council meeting I attend. She studied me for a moment in the moonlight, something soft crossing her usually guarded face. Leora hated these events. She used to disappear onto whatever balcony she could find within the first hour. I waited, unsure whether the comparison would sting the way it once had. It didn't, not really. It landed instead like an ordinary piece of information about someone she'd loved, offered without the desperate weight it used to carry. I don't hate them, I said. I just find them exhausting in a very specific way. Give me an archive over a ballroom any day. Noted, Seraphine said, and I believed her, and 3 weeks later I found my afternoon schedule quietly rearranged to include considerably more time in the library, and considerably less at obligatory social calls, with no explanation offered or needed. She showed me the observatory not long after that, a small domed structure on the castle's north tower that her mother had built decades before, mostly forgotten since her death, thick with dust and disuse when we first climbed the narrow stairs together. Seraphine cleaned the lens herself, with a care that told me more about her relationship with her mother than any story could have, and we spent that whole night charting stars neither of us could properly name, wrapped in the same blanket against the tower's persistent draft. She used to say the stars didn't care about any of it, Seraphine told me quietly, adjusting the old brass telescope. The wars, the politics, the grief. She said it helped her remember that most of what feels enormous down here is very small from far enough away. Do you believe that? I didn't, for a long time. She glanced at me, the observatory's single lamp catching the softness in her expression. I'm beginning to again. There was a carriage journey, too. Not long after, to a border garrison, Seraphine needed to inspect personally. 2 full days of travel each way, along roads rough enough that conversation became one of the only entertainments available to us. We talked more in that carriage than we had in whole weeks at the castle, about her childhood, spent mostly in the shadow of a mother who loved her fiercely, and a father who never quite forgave her for inheriting the family's magic instead of him, about my old life, the manuscripts, the particular kind of quiet satisfaction in saving something everyone else had already given up on. She fell asleep against my shoulder on the return journey, guard fully down, and I spent the last hour of that ride simply watching her, memorizing the unguarded lines of her face, thinking that whatever this had started as, it had become something I would fight to keep. I found the library 2 weeks in, on a gray afternoon when Seraphine was away inspecting the border garrisons and the castle felt too large and too quiet. It was, without exaggeration, the most beautiful room I had ever stood inside. 3 stories of shelving, a domed skylight, ladders on brass rails, the smell of old vellum and leather that hit something so deep and familiar in me that I nearly cried before I'd read a single title. This, at least, was mine. I knew how to move through a room like this, which was how I noticed within an hour that something in the Veyre family chronicles had been altered. A page cut cleanly from a bound ledger, the stub still visible if you knew to look for it. Dates in one section that contradicted dates in another, the ink of the correction slightly too fresh, too dark, for a document supposedly 40 years old. My training screamed at me. Someone had gone back through this family's history with a very careful hand and removed things. It was the locked cabinet in the back corner that undid me completely. It wasn't well hidden. Seraphine clearly hadn't expected anyone with my particular skill set to go looking, and the lock gave way to a hairpin faster than I want to admit. Inside were letters, dozens of them, in Seraphine's own square, controlled handwriting, dated years in the future relative to everything else in the room. Descriptions of political events that, as far as I could tell, hadn't happened yet. And beneath the letters, a small portrait in charcoal, unmistakably skilled, of a woman with dark hair and a wide, laughing mouth, looking up and to the left as though someone just out of frame had said something funny. The label beneath it read, Leora Veyre. The woman in the portrait had my nose, my chin, the particular tilt of my eyebrows when I was skeptical of something. She did not have Eveline's pale gold hair or fine bones. She looked nothing like the face in my mirror, and yet I knew, with the same bone-deep certainty I'd felt at the sound of her name, that I was looking at myself. You shouldn't be in here. I hadn't heard the door. Seraphine stood in the doorway in her traveling clothes, dust from the road still on her boots, and her voice was not angry so much as devastated. Who is she? I asked, holding up the portrait, my hands not quite steady. Seraphine. Who is Leora Veyre, and why does she have my face? For a long moment, I thought she wouldn't answer at all. Then she crossed the room slowly, like every step cost her something, and sat down heavily in the reading chair across from me. I knew you, she said, before you were born into this life. That's not an answer. That's a riddle. It's the truth I have. She rubbed a hand over her face, and for the first time I saw exactly how tired she was, how long she'd been carrying whatever this was, alone. I remember another version of this world, Eveline. A life I already lived once, that ended, and then began again, 8 years before I met you at that altar. In that life, there was no Eveline Marrow. There was a woman named Leora Veyre, a scholar's daughter who came to this castle, chasing corruption in the royal tax rolls, and who I loved more than I have ever loved anything before or since. She died protecting me. I died, eventually, years after her, alone. And then I woke up in my own younger body, with every memory intact and no one else who remembered any of it. The fire popped. Neither of us moved. I spent years looking for her, Seraphine continued, quieter now. There was no record of a Leora Veyre anywhere in this timeline. She had simply never existed. I told myself I had imagined the whole life, that grief had unmade my mind. And then I turned at my own wedding and found her face looking back at me with someone else's name. So you married me because I look like her. I agreed to the political marriage before I ever saw your face, she said. The crown arranged it. House Marrow needed the alliance. I had no say in who I married, only whether I refused outright and started a war I wasn't prepared to fight. I did not know what you looked like until the ceremony. Her jaw tightened. I nearly didn't make it through the vows. I set the portrait down because my hands genuinely couldn't hold it anymore. Am I her? Reincarnated? Or, I don't even know the word for what you're describing. I don't know, Seraphine admitted, and it seemed to cost her more than anything else she'd said. I don't know what you are to her. I only know what you're not, which is safe. If the pattern from my other life repeats itself here. She looked at me with something raw and unguarded. I have already watched this face die once. I would prefer not to do it again. I should have felt comforted. Instead, I felt something colder and stranger. A question that would follow me for weeks afterward. Did she want to protect me? Or did she want a second chance to save the woman she'd already lost? I didn't ask it aloud, not yet. I put the portrait back in its cabinet, locked it, and went to bed alone, and for the first time since waking in that blood-stained gown, I found myself grieving a life that had never technically been mine. The days that followed were quieter, but not calmer. I began, deliberately, to be someone Leora clearly hadn't been. I chose green instead of blue at every opportunity, sometimes pettily, sometimes just to watch what it did to Seraphine's face. I told the kitchen I disliked the honeyed pastries that appeared with suspicious regularity at breakfast, even though I secretly liked them, because I needed to know she could adjust to me rather than folding me back into a shape she already recognized. When she suggested, gently, that I might enjoy wearing my hair the way it had apparently once been worn in another life, I refused so sharply that she flinched, and I felt guilty about it for approximately 4 seconds before deciding the guilt wasn't mine to carry. I am not a second chance at someone else, I told her, one evening in the greenhouse she kept at the castle's south wall, surrounded by winter roses she'd somehow coaxed into blooming out of season. I need you to understand that. If you're going to love me, it has to be me. Not a door you're hoping opens onto her. She was quiet for a long time, turning a rose stem between her fingers with more care than the task required. You're right, she finally said. I've been trying to build you a life she would have wanted, without asking whether you wanted it. That's not love. That's mourning with extra steps. A small, unpracticed smile. I don't actually know what tea you prefer. I never asked. I assumed. Jasmine, I said. Not the honeyed one. And I hate writing, but I love watching it. And I fall asleep reading. And I always have. And I organize my books by how much I trust them, rather than alphabetically, which drives archivists insane, incidentally, including the one I used to be. Tell me, she said. And it wasn't a demand. It was an invitation, offered with the particular hunger of someone finally allowed to ask. So I did. Not everything. Not the headlights, not the rain. I wasn't ready for that yet. But enough. My old life, my old work. The particular satisfaction of saving a page everyone else had given up on. She listened like it was the most important intelligence she'd ever gathered. And by the end of that hour, something between us had shifted into a shape neither of us had a name for yet, but which felt, for the first time, sturdy enough to stand on. In between all of this, ordinary life kept insisting on happening, in the stubborn way ordinary life does, even inside a story that keeps threatening to turn into a tragedy. Seraphine took me to the training courtyard one gray morning, insisting, with the particular stubbornness of someone who has already decided the argument, that I learn at least the basics of defending myself. I was terrible at it. I want that on the record too. My footwork was clumsy, my grip on the practice blade all wrong, and I spent the first 20 minutes flat on my back in the dirt more often than upright, while Seraphine circled me with an expression of such intense concentration that I eventually accused her of finding the whole thing entertaining. "I would never," she said, entirely unconvincingly, offering me a hand up for the fourth time. "Again, weight on your back foot. You're enjoying this." "I am appreciating," she said, with as close to a smirk as I'd ever seen on her, "that the most feared woman in the North has apparently married the single least coordinated person in Astere." "I restore 400-year-old manuscripts with a scalpel," I told her, brushing dirt off my sleeve with as much dignity as I could manage. "My hands are precise. My footwork has simply never needed to be." "Your hands," she agreed, catching one of them and pressing a kiss to my knuckles that had absolutely nothing to do with sword training, "are extraordinary." I did eventually improve, marginally, enough to disarm her once, purely by accident, in a moment that left us both so surprised we simply stood there blinking at each other, until we started laughing, and the guards posted along the courtyard wall pretended very hard not to notice their Duchess laughing in public. The frozen lake came later that same month, on a morning cold enough that our breath hung visibly in the air between us. Seraphine had discovered, to her evident delight, that I had never once in my life skated on ice, and she considered this a deficiency requiring immediate correction. She was, unsurprisingly, extremely good at it. She moved across the ice like the shadow magic in her blood had simply decided to manifest as grace instead of danger, while I clung to her arm and shrieked every time my feet threatened to go out from under me. "I have led armies," she said, laughing, actually laughing, a sound I still hadn't gotten used to and hoped I never would, as she steadied me for the dozenth time. "I have negotiated treaties with kings who wanted me dead. I did not expect to find something that terrifies you more than either. Ice is undefeated," I told her, with as much solemnity as I could muster, while clutching her sleeve in a death grip. "I respect its power." She pulled me against her, both of us slightly unsteady on the ice, and kissed me there in the middle of the frozen lake with the winter sun, low and gold across the water. And for a moment, I forgot entirely that either of us had ever been afraid of anything. We visited a village under Veyre protection not long after. One Seraphine insisted on walking through without her usual retinue of guards trailing conspicuously behind her, a compromise we'd negotiated after our fight about my confinement, her concession to trusting me with a measure of ordinary freedom in exchange for my concession to never going anywhere entirely alone. Children ran up to her without any apparent fear at all, which surprised me until Mathilde later explained, with the dry pride of someone who'd known Seraphine since infancy, that the Duchess had personally funded the rebuilding of the village well after a drought 2 winters prior, and had done it quietly enough that most of the court never learned of it. I watched her crouch to accept a crown of woven grass from a girl who couldn't have been older than 6, watched the fearsome mask slip entirely away in the face of a child's solemn insistence that the crown made her look properly royal now, and felt something in my chest ache with a tenderness I hadn't expected a political marriage to ever produce. There was a ruined monastery, half a day's ride from the castle, that Seraphine took me to see, because its archive, what remained of it, after a fire generations past, held some of the oldest records in the region, untouched by whatever careful hand had been editing the Veyre family chronicles. We spent 2 full days there, sleeping in a drafty guest room with too few blankets and sharing them without complaint, and I lost myself entirely in the work of it, piecing together scorched fragments of parchment with the same absorbed patience I'd once brought to my old life's manuscripts, while Seraphine sat nearby reading reports and occasionally looking up just to watch me work, unguarded, like she still couldn't quite believe she was allowed this. "You look happy," she said, at one point, sounding faintly astonished by the observation. "I am happy," I told her, and watched that land in her, the way important things always seem to land in Seraphine, quietly and completely, and with a flicker of disbelief that she was allowed to have this too. There was also, memorably, a servant's celebration for the winter solstice that Mathilde insisted the household observe properly, despite Seraphine's evident discomfort with festivities of any kind. I discovered, to my enormous delight, that the Black Duchess of the North, feared strategist, wielder of shadow magic, terror of 3 noble houses, was catastrophically, endearingly awkward at dancing, standing at the edge of the hall with the stiff posture of someone facing a diplomatic crisis rather than a folk dance. "You're allowed to enjoy this," I told her, pulling her by both hands into the circle of dancers despite her obvious resistance. "I don't know the steps. Neither do half these people. Look at them." I nodded toward a red-faced stable hand who was, indeed, entirely out of rhythm with the music. "Nobody's watching you, Seraphine. Nobody's grading this." She was terrible at it, gloriously and completely terrible, treading on my feet twice and losing the rhythm entirely during the turns, and by the end of the dance she was laughing too hard to be embarrassed about any of it. Her carefully maintained composure scattered somewhere across the hall floor, along with everyone else's inhibitions, and Mathilde watched the whole thing from the doorway with an expression of such profound satisfaction that I understood, without needing to be told, exactly how rare this sight was for her too. The attempt on my life came 3 weeks later, at the winter market in the village beneath the castle walls, and it came from a direction the novel had never mentioned at all. I was examining bolts of dyed wool with Cassia, who had, grudgingly, and with the air of someone still reserving final judgment, begun accompanying me on outings, when a man in a merchant's apron drew a blade from beneath his stall and lunged. I remember very little of the actual moment, except that it happened faster than thought, and that I was on the ground with someone's elbow in my ribs before I understood I'd been shoved out of the way, and that the world had gone very dark very suddenly, shadow pouring off Seraphine like smoke off a fire, wrapping the attacker's arms and throat before he'd taken a second step. She didn't kill him. I want to be clear about that, because everything I'd read about her suggested she would have, without hesitation, and instead, she held him immobile in coils of living darkness, while her guards restrained him properly, her face a mask of controlled fury that made every person in that market square take an involuntary step back. "Who sent you?" she said, and her voice carried an authority that had nothing to do with volume. He didn't answer. He didn't get the chance to, later, either. He was found dead in his cell 2 days after, tongue cut out before he died, which told us everything we needed to know about how seriously someone was taking the possibility of him talking. Seraphine's reaction afterward was, in its own way, worse than the attack itself. Guards tripled at every door. My movements outside the castle restricted to the point of house arrest, a schedule of my day drawn up and approved by 3 separate people before I was allowed to keep it. "I can't live like this," I told her, 3 days into the new arrangement, standing in her study while she reviewed the latest security report without looking up. "I understand you're afraid. I am too, but you cannot lock me in a beautiful cage and call it love." "I watched you die once," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word in a way I'd never heard from her before, in a way that made the guards outside the door go very still. "Do not ask me to stand calmly while it happens again." The silence after that sentence had weight. I finally understood, fully, what I'd been circling for weeks, that every guard, every locked door, every impossible knowledge of my preferences was Seraphine trying to win a war she'd already lost once, fought against an enemy that didn't yet have a face. "Tell me everything," I said. "Not fragments, everything. I can't fight beside you if I don't know what we're fighting." So slowly, over the following nights, she did. She told me about a scholar's daughter who'd arrived at Veyre Castle investigating corrupted tax records and ended up arguing with the Duchess of Veyre in the library at 2 in the morning, both of them too stubborn to concede a single point. Both of them, it turned out, quietly falling in love with the argument itself. She told me about years of careful, guarded happiness, about a woman who'd laughed at Seraphine's reputation and called her bluff every single time, about a scar beneath her ribs that Leora used to trace with careful fingers, while pretending she wasn't checking it hadn't reopened. She told me, in pieces, about a conspiracy involving a prince named Adrian Valecourt, who wanted House Veyre broken and was clever enough to let other people do the breaking. About the night a magical weapon meant for Seraphine had found Leora instead. About holding her while she died, and understanding, with total clarity, that nothing that came after would ever matter as much. "I destroyed everyone responsible," Seraphine said, staring into the fire rather than at me. "It took me 11 years. It didn't help. I died alone, hollowed out, and then I woke up young again, with the whole weight of that grief still in my chest, and no one left alive who remembered why I carried it." She finally looked at me, and then I saw your face at my own wedding, and 8 years of certainty that I'd imagined the entire thing collapsed in a single second. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about the headlights, the rain, the scalpel and the lamp, and the manuscripts I'd never finish restoring. I thought about a body that wasn't mine, and a name that wasn't mine, and a woman who'd apparently loved someone with my soul across at least 2 separate lifetimes, and I understood, finally, why the question of whether my feelings were my own had been keeping me awake. "I need you to hear this," I told her. "I am not going to become her for you. I can't. I don't have her memories. I don't have her habits. Most of what I know about her, I learned from a locked cabinet and your own grief. If you need Leora back, I am the wrong woman for that job, no matter what my face used to look like 8 years ago, in a life neither of us actually lived together." I made myself keep going, even though it hurt. "But if you can love whoever I turn out to be, green instead of blue, jasmine instead of honey, terrified of thunderstorms for reasons I still can't name, then I think I might already be falling in love with you. Not with your grief, with you." She made a sound I'd never heard her make before, something between a laugh and something breaking, and crossed the room to kneel in front of my chair, taking my hands in both of hers, careful of the healing cuts on my wrists. "Who am I looking at right now?" I asked her, because I needed to hear it said plainly, once, before either of us went any further. "You," she said, without a single second of hesitation. "Eveline. Not a ghost, not a second chance. You." I kissed her first. I want that on the record, because everything about that castle, that marriage, that whole impossible situation, had been arranged around me without my consent. And this one thing, was mine to choose, and I chose it. Her hands came up to hold my face the way they had that very first morning. Except this time, they weren't shaking with grief. They were shaking with something else entirely. And when we finally broke apart, she rested her forehead against mine and breathed like she'd been holding it for 8 years. "I locked the cabinet again this morning," she admitted quietly, against my mouth. "Properly. This time, I think I've been trying to rebuild a life around you, instead of building a new one. I don't want to do that anymore." The weeks after that turned into something I hadn't let myself hope for. An actual marriage, built one ordinary moment at a time, rather than one crisis at a time. I taught myself the greenhouse's rotation of blooms because Seraphine liked showing me new things, and I liked watching her try. She attempted, disastrously, to cook a meal for my birthday and set a saucepan on fire in the process. And I laughed so hard I had to sit down, and she looked so wounded and so pleased at once that I kissed the soot off her cheek instead of finishing the joke I'd been building toward. Cassia, having apparently decided I wasn't a magical trap after all, began seeking me out deliberately, sharp-tongued and generous in equal measure, and taught me the political shorthand of court gossip over strong tea. Mathilde stopped hovering and started including me, unasked, in the household's decisions, which I understood. The way you understand things in a language you're only beginning to speak was its own kind of trust. We fell asleep together for the first time, not because either of us planned it, but because Seraphine, reading beside me late one night with her guard so far down I almost didn't recognize her, simply drifted off mid-sentence, her head against my shoulder, and I didn't have the heart to wake her. I lay there a long time listening to her breathe, slow and even, the most feared woman in the north, sleeping deeply enough to snore very faintly, and I thought, this is the safest I have ever seen her. I chose not to move for 3 hours. My arm went entirely numb. I would do it again without hesitation. It was during one of those quiet nights that I had the dream. Not my own dream. I understood that the moment it started, the way you understand you're in someone else's memory rather than your own. I was Leora, laughing at something Seraphine had said in a garden I recognized from the portrait's background. And then I was Leora on the ground with a wound blooming dark across my chest, and Seraphine's face above mine was younger and more frightened than I had ever seen it. And my only thought, my entire dying thought, wasn't fear for myself at all. Don't let this destroy you, please. Whatever happens after me, don't let it destroy you. I woke gasping, tears already falling, and Seraphine was there instantly, the way she always was, pulling me against her without asking what was wrong. I saw it, I told her, once I could speak. The end. Her end. She wasn't afraid of dying, Seraphine. She was afraid of what it would do to you. I pulled back to look at her properly. You have to know that. Whatever guilt you've been carrying, she never once blamed you. Her last thought was for you, not against you. Seraphine didn't answer for a long time. When she finally did, her voice was thick. I've never told anyone that story without them trying to comfort me with lies. Thank you for not doing that. I found out about the deeper conspiracy the way I found out most things in that castle, through paper and patience, and the particular attention I paid to things other people overlooked. A coded journal, hidden in the false bottom of a jewelry box Eveline had apparently kept from her childhood home, written in a cipher I only recognized because it echoed a restoration technique I'd used 100 times on damaged manuscripts, reading between lines that had been deliberately obscured. Eveline Marrow had not been a foolish traitor eager to betray her marriage for royal favor. She had been a frightened young woman being blackmailed by her own father, Lord Edmund Marrow, who needed leverage over House Veyre and had decided his daughter's marriage was the perfect vehicle. The window she'd broken trying to escape, the blood on the gown I'd woken up in, that hadn't been panic at marrying a monster. That had been a last, desperate attempt to flee a trap her own family had built around her, hours before I ever arrived in her body to inherit it. The journal named names: Prince Adrian Vailcourt, several members of the Royal Council, a plan, meticulously laid out over months, to provoke Seraphine into a public display of forbidden magic severe enough to justify moving against House Veyre entirely, and Eveline's planned death, we now understood, had never been incidental. It had been the spark. A murdered bride, blamed on a monstrous wife, was exactly the kind of story that turned political rivals into righteous crusaders. I brought the journal to Seraphine, white-faced and shaking. The novel I read, I told her, it got this wrong. It wasn't neutral. Whoever survived to tell that story afterward controlled what got written down, and they wrote themselves as heroes. Prince Adrian, when he next visited the castle under the guise of goodwill, was every bit as charming as I remembered from the book. Warm, quick-witted, apparently genuinely concerned about my welfare in a marriage he gently implied might be more controlling than loving. Some of what he said even had a grain of truth in it. Seraphine's protectiveness had, at times, tipped into something suffocating. That grain of truth was exactly what made him dangerous. For one uncomfortable week, his careful concern actually worked on me, planting doubt about whether Seraphine's guarded secrecy was protection or control, until I found, independently, correspondence in the palace archive, under an assumed reason for visiting that Cassia helped me arrange, proving his direct hand in commissioning the same magical weapon that had killed Leora in Seraphine's previous life, now being quietly recreated under a different name. I chose to believe Seraphine, not because the story demanded it of me, but because the evidence did, and because trust, by then, was something we'd actually built rather than something either of us had simply assumed. The masquerade fell on the date I'd been dreading since the very first week, the same date, near enough, on which the novel's version of Eveline had died. We could have avoided the ball entirely. We discussed it, at length, in the small hours before it. But the conspiracy would proceed with or without our attendance, and hiding from it only ceded the choice of when and how it happened to people who wished us dead. The night before, I found Seraphine standing alone at her study window, long after the castle had gone quiet, still fully dressed, staring out at nothing. "You've been counting the days," I said. It wasn't a question. "Since the altar," she admitted. "I know exactly how many are left before tomorrow. I have known for months. She turned to look at me, and for once she didn't try to hide how frightened she was. I don't know if I survive losing you twice, Eveline. I need you to know that, even though I know it isn't fair to put that on you. You don't get to love me only by preparing for my death, I said, crossing the room to take her hands. That's not a life, that's a vigil. I need you to actually live with me. Tonight, tomorrow, all of it. Instead of just bracing for the ending you've already decided is coming. She kissed me then like she was trying to memorize it, careful and thorough and unbearably tender, and I kissed her back the same way. And that night, for the first time, we didn't sleep in separate beds or separate rooms or separate fears. I won't describe what happened between us in detail. Some things belong only to the two people who lived them. But I will say that when morning came, gray and quiet and achingly peaceful, I had never in either of my lives felt more certain of anything than I did lying in her arms, watching her finally sleep without flinching. The masquerade itself was a blur of masks and candlelight and careful political choreography. We arrived together, deliberately visible, Seraphine in dark formal dress with silver thread at the collar and a mask that left her eyes uncovered, because she wanted every conspirator in that ballroom to see exactly who they were dealing with. I wore green, as I always did now, a small private rebellion that had become simply my own preference, rather than a statement against anyone else's ghost. Cassia moved through the crowd all evening, gathering fragments of conversation with the ease of someone born to it, feeding us small updates disguised as idle small talk, each time our paths crossed near the refreshment tables. Mathilde, of all people, had insisted on attending as well, tucked discreetly near the servants' entrance, with a look on her face that suggested she would personally strangle anyone who came near either of us. I danced twice, badly, with Seraphine, both of us using the movement to scan the room, rather than enjoy the music, and I felt the particular, focused calm that came from finally facing a danger we'd spent months preparing for, rather than simply dreading. Adrian found me near the terrace doors sometime after midnight, charming as ever, complimenting my gown, asking with practiced concern whether married life had been treating me kindly. I smiled and gave him nothing, and watched something behind his easy expression calculate and recalculate, and understood that he knew, or at least suspected, that his careful campaign to turn me against my own wife had failed completely. I only ever wanted to see you safe, Lady Marrow, he said, and it might even have been half true, in the specific, self-serving way that made him so effective. I am safe, I told him. I've simply stopped needing you to define what that means. His people moved when the musicians reached the third dance, exactly as our evidence had predicted, attempting to isolate Seraphine in the East Gallery under cover of a staged argument between two noble houses loyal to the crown. I was supposed to be safely elsewhere, dancing attendance on a dowager countess Cassia had assigned me as a diversion. I wasn't there. I'd learned enough from Seraphine's own training sessions in the courtyard to know that safety, that night, meant staying close enough to see the trap coming, not far enough to be protected from it. I saw the weapon before Seraphine did, a slim, dark device concealed in a servant's sleeve, aimed at her back while her attention was locked on the staged argument in front of her. In the version of events I'd read, in the version of events Seraphine had lived once already, this was the moment someone died to save her. I did not let it be that moment again. I threw myself into the servant's arm hard enough to spoil his aim, and the shot went wide, shattering a window instead of a spine, and then Seraphine's shadow magic came down over the gallery like the night sky falling, and between the two of us, her power and my warning, the conspirators found themselves suddenly, catastrophically outmaneuvered. Guards Cassia had quietly stationed beforehand moved in. Lord Marrow, confronted publicly with his daughter's coded journal, went the color of old parchment and offered no defense at all. Prince Adrian's practiced charm did not survive contact with hard evidence read aloud before half the assembled nobility of Astaire. We survived because we acted together, not because Seraphine saved me alone, the way she'd saved Leora alone and lost her for it, not because I sacrificed myself the way the pattern demanded. We broke the pattern by refusing to play our assigned parts in it. Somewhere past midnight, in a quiet antechamber away from the chaos still unfolding in the ballroom, I realized the date had passed. The exact hour that Eveline Marrow was supposed to have died had come and gone, and I was standing here, breathing, my hand in Seraphine's, both of us bruised and disheveled and completely, gloriously alive. Seraphine realized it in the same instant I did. I watched 8 years of certainty, the absolute conviction that this night would end the way the last one had, simply fail to arrive, and something in her that had been braced for so long finally, quietly collapsed. Not in front of the court. She waited until we were alone, until the door was shut, and then the most feared woman in the north put her face against my shoulder and wept like she hadn't allowed herself to in years, and I held her and let her, and for once neither of us was protecting the other from a future we thought we already knew. There was no novel left to consult. There was no previous life to fear repeating. There was only whatever we chose to build next, together, from nothing. The aftermath took longer than the crisis itself, the way it always does. Prince Adrian was stripped of his succession rights and exiled to a remote holding under permanent watch, the council too embarrassed by his exposure to allow anything louder. House Marrow's influence collapsed within a season. My father, Eveline's father, quietly removed from court and left to manage what remained of his estate in disgraced obscurity. I visited him exactly once, found no reconciliation worth having, and did not visit again, choosing instead to build whatever legacy I wanted from Eveline's name rather than his. Seraphine's reputation shifted, slowly and unevenly. She was still formidable, still intimidating in a room, still perfectly capable of terrifying anyone foolish enough to threaten what she loved. But she no longer needed fear as her only language, and something in the court's regard for her softened accordingly, respect replacing dread by careful degrees. I reorganized the Veyre archive myself over the following months, cataloging not just the family's history, but the erased and altered pages I'd first noticed in that library, restoring, where I could, the versions of events that self-interested men had cut away. Scholars from as far as the Royal University began writing to request access, and I found myself, somewhat to my own astonishment, becoming something like an authority on erased history throughout the kingdom, invited to advise on record-keeping reforms that had nothing to do with being anyone's wife, and everything to do with skills I'd carried with me from a life I never expected to use again. It became, unexpectedly, the work I'd loved before, transplanted into a world that had never once asked whether it wanted me in it, and which I had decided, quietly and firmly, to claim anyway. Cassia became something close to a sister, sharp-tongued and fiercely loyal in the particular way of people who'd started out suspicious of you and ended up devoted precisely because that suspicion had been thorough enough to earn their trust honestly. Mathilde began, very occasionally, to smile at me without prompting, which from her counted as an outright declaration of affection, and took to leaving small treats in my study whenever I worked too late, exactly the way she'd once fed me more than I could finish during that first frightened week, except now it felt less like charity and more like family. Seraphine and I fought sometimes, in the months that followed, the way any two stubborn people do. She still hovered when I insisted on riding alone into the village. I still took risks she considered reckless, and I considered reasonable. We argued, and apologized, and built the kind of private shorthand that only comes from actually living beside someone rather than mythologizing them. Late one spring afternoon, she took me to a lake I'd never visited, ringed by white flowers just beginning to bloom, and I understood, the second I saw it, that this was the lake from her memories, from Leora's memories, the place two versions of my soul had apparently once been happy together in a life I still couldn't fully recall. "Do you still love her?" I asked, because I needed to know, and because I trusted her enough by then to survive whatever the true answer was. Seraphine considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, rather than rushing to reassure me. "Yes," she finally said. "A part of me always will. She was real, and what we had was real, and I won't pretend otherwise just to make this easier." She turned to face me fully, taking both my hands. "But loving her doesn't diminish loving you. You're not a shadow of her, or a second draft. You're the reason I finally understand the difference between mourning someone and honoring them. I don't need you to become her, Eveline. I never did, not really. I only thought I did, because grief is a very persuasive liar. She smiled, small and real. I love you, not instead of her, alongside everything she meant to me, and entirely separate from it. I found, to my own surprise, that I could accept that completely, that Leora was neither a rival for my heart, nor simply an earlier version of me to be jealous of, but part of the strange, improbable thread that had brought Seraphine and me to the same lake on the same spring afternoon, 3 lives and 1 unbroken love apart. We returned to the room where all of it began on the anniversary of our wedding, the room I'd first woken in wearing borrowed blood and a stranger's fear. The window had long since been repaired. The glass had been swept away months ago. It didn't feel cold anymore. It felt, unmistakably, like ours. Are you certain? Seraphine asked me that night, standing in the doorway, with a quiet vulnerability that still occasionally caught me off guard, given everything I knew about the woman the rest of the kingdom feared. I thought about the irony of it, that the woman who'd once seemed destined to own me, use me, or discard me, now asked my permission for absolutely everything that mattered, every single time, without fail. I'm certain, I said, and meant it more completely than I had ever meant anything in either of my lives. I woke up in someone else's doomed story, Seraphine. I'm not living in it anymore. I'm living in ours. She crossed the room and kissed me the way she had that very first night in the greenhouse, careful and searching, except there was no grief left in it at all now, only choice, freely and repeatedly made, by 2 women who had finally stopped waiting for history to decide what happened to them next. Outside, the same stars turned overhead that had turned over a girl named Leora once, and a girl named Eveline before her, and now turned over the 2 of us, unhurried, patient, indifferent to which story we told about how we'd gotten here, because the only part that had ever truly mattered was the part we chose ourselves, together, in the light of an ordinary, unremarkable, entirely ours night.